Okay, so today I'm introducing you to one of the major artistic movements of the early 20th century, the Harlem Renaissance. Um, so I'll talk a little bit more about this. So this kind of comes in our discussions or our readings in modernism, and I do see this as a modernist movement. It's also a distinctly black movement, artistic movement. So I'll talk more about that as we move forward. But basically, to introduce you to the Harlem Renaissance, I had you read two essays that kind of give a little bit of a sense of how people and artists of the time were understanding Black identity and understanding Black art. So, kind of through Zora Neale Hurston and Langston Hughes, we are learning about the Harlem Renaissance. But before we get to their essays and kind of to your responses, which is again the place that you're really engaging with the texts, I want to give you some background, historical and kind of artistic background or frameworks for understanding the Harlem Renaissance. Okay, so here's some historical background for the Harlem Renaissance. Okay, so like I said, a Harlem Renaissance was this major kind of movement in Black culture. How did that happen? Like, what were the historical conditions that led to something like the Harlem Renaissance? Well, the Great Migration is a major historical and cultural kind of event that influenced this particular cultural movement. So, what is the Great Migration? It was a migration of the black population from rural South to cities in the North, especially Chicago, New York City, Washington D.C., Baltimore. So this is kind of starts post World War One, and actually goes into the 1970s. So I think in 1910, about 90% of the Black population lived in the South, and a majority of those people also lived in rural areas. So the Great Migration was a large number of these people, of these Black people, or of the Black population that lived in the South and lived in rural areas, moved from the South to the North and moved from rural to urban city centers. Why did they move? Well, in the post Civil War era in the South, segregation was legal, really into the 60s, right? We know this history. So they were trying to escape legal segregation in the South, and specifically the kind of spread of racist ideologies and violence towards the Black population in the form of things like lynching. So these legal kind of movements of segregation, this is what the Black population was seeking to escape. And so we have a picture here on our PowerPoint of a Black family moving from the South to the North. I think it's a really striking image. Okay, so that's a little bit about the Great Migration, which we'll talk about a little bit more when we read A Raisin in the Sun in a couple weeks. So just keep that in mind. This idea of the kind of a large portion or a majority of the Black population leaving rural South to move to urban North. Okay, so another kind of historical or just historical background here is the city of Harlem itself, or the neighborhood of Harlem, I should say. So Harlem is a neighborhood in New York City, and during the Great Migration, kind of in the early days of the Great Migration, it became almost had a complete or totally Black population was living in Harlem. So it became this kind of neighborhood of people who moved from or of the Black population. So it's basically totally Black population in Harlem. It becomes the center of Black cultural life during the 20s, right? So this is Harlem, and I think we probably are familiar with this, but Harlem is the place for jazz, for kind of the emerging Black middle class, the emerging artistic class of Black people in the United States, of the African American community. Okay, so another historical event or historical important historical development is the rise of blues and jazz. So blues and jazz are um, music types of music that are particularly and distinctly Black and distinctly American. So they come out of the slave spiritual tradition. So there are kind of roots or connections to um, African music, which I think we can see in the essays that we read today, in Hurston and Hughes's work, that they're both really kind of conscious of jazz, the connection between jazz and maybe African music or African identity. But these are really important forms of music. It's kind of the first type of music or that's distinctly American, and it's important that that distinctly American type of music or form of art is coming out of the Black community. Okay, so another thing that's really important, so blues and jazz are really important for Black artists of the Harlem Renaissance. So this is a source, it's an influence, it's a inspiration for people like Hurston and Hughes. Okay, so this was originally known as the New Negro Movement. And let me just talk about this word really quick because it's kind of an uncomfortable word for me to say. It's maybe a little bit uncomfortable for you to say. At this time, we're thinking like in the 20s, this word Negro was the accepted term for the Black population. It would be like saying African American or Black. So I'm going to be using it just in context, right? Trying to use it only kind of in the way that like Hughes, right? In his title, he uses this, or and we'll see it again on Thursday when we read Hughes's poetry. So I'm saying this because it's in class we could have this conversation. It would be probably fairly easy just to talk about this, but I just want us to make sure that we know that when we use this word in the kind of cultural context of the literature, it is not meant to be offensive, but actually was an accepted term and the term that they were using to define themselves. Okay, so the Harlem Renaissance, which is now called the Harlem Renaissance, was called the New Negro Movement. So there's a few really interesting things about this. So this movement was kind of initiated by an anthology edited by Alain Locke. So he was an important professor, important academic, but also supporter of the arts during the time of the Harlem Renaissance. So you can see here on the PowerPoint, I have it open to the title page. So it's also really interesting that it included these, I think, really striking portraits and showing kind of the variety of Black experience. So this anthology really initiated this movement and kind of showed like these are the Black artists that you should be thinking about, or the Black literary artists and visual artists that you should be that are defining kind of Black culture in this moment. So this term, kind of New Negro Movement, is really interesting because one, it's consciously showing that they're trying to initiate something new. They're trying to initiate something that has not existed before. So there's and this would be too like some of the kind of first generations where their Black identity isn't shaped by slavery or the specter of slavery. Of course, there's still segregation. There's still these kind of oppressions existing that are echoes of slavery. But I think they really saw themselves as kind of outside of that. So they're trying to create something new. And uh, seeing themselves as a part, having like a new kind of Black identity. They're also trying to consciously build a community of artists and an artistic movement. So this idea of movement is really interesting, that they're all kind of working together to initiate or create something new. And they're consciously creating as Black artists. That's really important. We see that in the Hughes essay, but this idea that their Black identity, their race, is kind of necessary to the art that they're creating. So, okay, so that was the original kind of way of, or that was the original title of this movement, and it gives us, suggests to us certain ways that they were thinking at the beginning of this movement. Okay, so the word Renaissance is really interesting. So Renaissance, we know from like Renaissance painting, somebody like Michelangelo, right? So a Renaissance is a kind of wellspring of creativity and art making. So like a new fountain of creativity that's happening. So they really saw themselves as kind of tapping in or creating this new wellspring of art. So they see it as a renaissance. So this is really a period of remarkable creativity in all forms of art. So it's touching all kind of art forms: literature, music, dance, painting, and sculpture by African American artists. And this movement, this renaissance, this artistic development is centered in Harlem. So this is the place that it's happening, right? There are artists, kind of Black artists from all over the United States, creating new or creating art at this time, but this movement is centered in Harlem. And so they try to kind of capture the energy of the neighborhood at this period of time. So, what are some main distinct features of the Harlem Renaissance, of the art that comes out of the Harlem Renaissance? So there's a pride in Black life and identity. So they want to show Black life and identity. But that doesn't mean that they're going to show it in a true way, in a real way, in a way that doesn't candy coat anything. So we see this in both essays. These writers are really concerned with creating art that shows Black people as real people. But there is a kind of pride there. There's a kind of understanding of, I think in the Hughes essay, we hear him even say like, Black is beautiful, right? That movement didn't happen until probably the 70s, but there was already this sense of finding beauty and excitement in the Black identity, but also showing it in reality. And part of that is there's this rising consciousness of inequality and discrimination. So not only in the South, but in the North. And so these artists are trying to point this out and trying to show this as like something that is common for the Black community and individuals who are Black. So they're not going to show, like, again, like I said earlier, they're not candy coating anything. They're not candy coating the experiences of Black people. So there's a rising consciousness of inequality and discrimination. They are interested, like other modernists, in the rapidly changing modern world, right? So if we think about the Great Migration as moving from rural to urban, a lot of these artists are dealing with what does it mean now to be in the city, to be a part of the city, to kind of both be energized by the vitality of the city, but also the problems that come with urban life, in housing, in like what kind of opportunities are offered to the Black population. So that's a really important feature as well. And they're seeking freedom of expression through the arts. So they're not like, they don't want to be limited to traditional forms. So they're developing and using modernist techniques for kind of new contexts. So again, I see this as a modernist movement because they are really concerned with some of the same things. We'll see this with Hughes, but using kind of the language of the people and using rhythms not rhythms that are based on kind of traditional forms, but finding new forms to represent something new in the modern world and the new Black experience in city centers of the modern world. Okay? So I wanted to bring in some visual art from this period because I think it helps to exemplify some of what was happening culturally, and also what the Harlem Renaissance was seeking to do artistically. So James Van Der Zee was a photographer and kind of known for depicting the experiences of middle class and kind of a rising new upper class. So we can see these people right there. This is a very urban context here, and also showing these. They're almost like kingly, queenly here, right? So showing this new experience of Blackness and the kind of almost decadence of this period. One thing I didn't talk about is really the Harlem Renaissance ends during the Great Depression. So, like most things, or like most kind of horrible events that happen in the United States, the Great Depression hits the Black population worse, and in worse ways. So, this kind of picture after the 20s we might not have seen as much. So it's really kind of capturing an experience that occurs in the 20s during the height of the Harlem Renaissance. Okay, Aaron Douglas is a really interesting painter. You could see, I think, in his work a little bit of like a Picasso influence, a kind of cubism happening here with the shapes and the color. But I think in these two images, we can see a lot of concerns that are happening with the Harlem Renaissance and what artists are seeking to depict. So with this here, we see these people kind of Black people almost silhouetted here. It's an interesting choice, but they're wearing kind of shackles, so there's a sense of kind of oppression, of bondage, but there's also this kind of freedom that's happening. You might be able to see a drum. I just want you to look at these pictures and see what you can kind of pull out that's connected to the Harlem Renaissance. Really amazing picture. I think this one kind of represents how I was talking about the Harlem Renaissance in terms of both being an urban movement and a movement really concerned with the modern world, but also seeing like music and jazz as an influence. So we have this figure here with the saxophone. We have these other workers and strivers kind of on the cogs of the machine. So looking at this is a common motif in a lot of art of this time. So seeing the modern world as this kind of machine that we're stuck in the cogs. Think about that famous Charlie Chaplin, Modern Times film where he gets stuck in the cogs. So that's what he's playing with here. We can see these skyscrapers, which are new inventions of this time period, towering over these people, almost like a mountain. So this is interesting to connect to Hughes's essay. So they're like mountainous, covering these people, but there seems to be some kind of salvation, some kind of hope happening in this figure in the middle. So we see a lot of kind of tension between these oppression of the Black population and kind of the freedom and the desire to seek freedom in this art. Vinold Rice was actually a white artist and painter, but he was kind of a chronicler of the Harlem Renaissance. You can see if we go back to this the cover page of the anthology, who did the Weinhold Rice did the portraits. So it's really interesting to think that here's this white person, but who wants to kind of tap into the energy of this movement. But he was really known for depicting the black people not as like oppressed, but in these kind of very proud and like depicting the kind of varieties of black experience in a straightforward but proud kind of depiction. So I love this one here. This seems so contemporary to me. Like it could be somebody could post it on Instagram. It could become some kind of meme or something. And then like the certain things like the natural hair, just the gaze of this young woman who's staring straight at you. It's a really striking image. This is actually Langston Hughes. So Weinhold Rice was known for depicting a lot of the major artists of the time period. Very contemplative pose, right? Showing him as this very thoughtful, very important artist. Okay, so this is Langston Hughes. So what I want us to think about this visual art is just the way that they're tapping into these different issues of concern for Harlem Renaissance artists, and thinking about how that also plays out in the text that we read. So here's Langston Hughes. So let's just talk a little bit about his essay. So the Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain. So he's using the essay form. So what does that mean? So this is not a narrative, right? This is not a story, right? It is an essay that includes an argument. He's trying to get something across, right? He's trying to tell us something, tell the reader something. It might be interesting to think about who would this artist, or who would the reader, who is the audience, who is the reader of this essay? Who is he writing to? Is he writing to a white audience? Is he writing to a black audience? Is he writing to both? Is he writing to a younger audience that is seeking to be artists? There's lots to think about there in terms of audience. I didn't make that a response question, but that would have been a good question. So he has this main argument. So I want you to think, like, what is he really trying to get across? What is his argument here? What is he trying to say? And then he uses personal experience and other examples to support. So this is also part of the essay form. Often there's personal experiences to kind of show or exemplify the argument that someone's trying to make, or the point that they're trying to get across. So he uses his own experience as a black artist, and he thinks about other people's experience too. Okay, so so what is this main argument? What is the problem that he sees, and what is he trying to address? So he also explores, and I think this is really important, the specific difficulties of being a black artist in the early 20th century in America. So what are those specific issues? So there's issues both from a white readership, a white audience, and issues from a black audience, right? Where it's kind of showing black artists as in between a rock and a hard place, right? Certain black people, maybe older, maybe more upper class black readers, want to see the black population depicted in a certain way. White readers want, in a kind of tradition, as part of a long tradition of black people entertaining white people, want to kind of be entertained, right? But he's saying something different. He wants to see artists doing something different. And he also brings into his essay black popular culture, so specifically jazz. So thinking about jazz as this source, as this inspiration, and as this embodiment of what it means to be a new black person at this time. So think about that. That is one of our response questions. What is he doing with jazz? Why does he use this term tom-tom? What is that suggesting? He's also really concerned about real depiction of black identity. So black identity, like the truth about the black population, not a sanitized or candy-coated version of blackness and of the reality that of what black people experience in their daily life. Okay, so these are some entry points to this essay, right? Really short readings for this week, nothing too hard. So yeah, okay. Zora Neale Hurston, I love these pictures. I love pictures of Zora Neale Hurston. You can feel kind of the energy she has, the joy that she emanates, and you can see that in the text. And I think these pictures really capture that with her like jaunty hat, and her fur coat here. Zora Neale Hurston was a really interesting person. We get a sense of her biography from this essay. So she had this great rise during the Harlem Renaissance, but really by the time she's creating her best art in the 30s, she doesn't have a readership, right? This movement breaks down, which means people are not as interested in the art created by black artists. And she essentially dies unknown. She was one of the most important figures of the Harlem Renaissance, but dies as kind of an unknown person in Florida. There was a lot of recovery work had to be done to find her work and to figure out who she was. What was I going to say? Oh yeah, she has this also really interesting part of her background. She studied anthropology at Barnard College, and so she has this kind of anthropological bent towards trying to understand people, trying to understand communities. She did a lot of what's the word? A lot of work with studying kind of the folk traditions of the black population in the South. So she spent a lot of time in the South kind of recording oral traditions and oral stories. So let's talk about her essay. So whereas Langston Hughes uses personal experience to develop his argument, I would call this a personal essay. So it's almost memoirish. So it's depicting Hurston's own coming of age. She's exploring a specific issue. Like, what does it feel to be a black person, a person of color? How does that feel? So she's exploring that idea, but it's really about her experience. So it's her individual experience of being raced. What I mean by that is how racial identity both shapes her identity, but also does not give the full picture. So she's really interested in how does this shape who I am, being black shape who I am, but also how does it limit me, or how does it not show who I am? So she explores black identity in different contexts, and we see her at different points in her life and in different contexts. Well, there's Eaton, Florida, which is a fully black community. Then she moves to Jacksonville, Florida, which is a southern city, so something shifts there. She goes to Barnard College, which is almost completely white environment. And then we see her in the New World Cafe, which is a popular Harlem nightclub. So we see her identity and kind of how that identity fits into different contexts, and what does that do for her and for how she understands her blackness and just her identity in general.